They called it the Mountain of Failure. For 25 years, it grew, not like a garden grows, with care and intention and hope. It grew like a wound grows, spreading and deepening and becoming part of the landscape until people stopped seeing it as something new and started seeing it as something that had always been there. A massive, rotting pile of bark scraps and wood chips and sawdust that spilled from the bed of the mill's trucks every morning at dawn, dumped unceremoniously at the edge of a property that no one had wanted in the first place. The mill owned the valley. It had owned the valley for 3 generations, long before the government built the highway that cut through the hills, long before the town grew into a city, long before anyone thought to question what a factory was allowed to leave behind. It employed half the county. It fed families. It sent children to college. And in exchange for all this prosperity, it asked only for one thing that no one seemed to mind until it was too late: permission to dump its waste wherever it pleased. The property it chose belonged to a woman named Margaret. She was not a farmer when she bought the land. She was a seamstress, or at least she had been, back when her fingers were nimble and her eyes could thread a needle without squinting. But the years had taken their toll. A car accident had shattered her pelvis and left her with a limp that never went away, and the settlement had disappeared faster than anyone could have predicted. Medical bills, the mortgage on a house she lost, the child support she paid to a husband who had left her when the money ran out, then the drinking started. By the time Margaret was 42, she had nothing. Nothing except a 20-acre parcel of land at the dead end of a dirt road that the real estate agent had been trying to sell for 6 years. The soil was clay, heavy and gray and stubborn, the kind of earth that laughed at seeds and broke plows. The previous owner had tried to farm it and had walked away after 3 seasons, leaving behind a rusted tractor and a well that ran brown with iron. The property was cheap because it was worthless, and Margaret bought it because it was all she could afford with the last of her savings and a loan from her sister that she knew she would never be able to repay. She moved into a house that was not much more than a cabin. The roof sagged. The windows were held together with tape and prayers. The porch tilted to one side, as if the building itself was tired and leaning toward the earth, ready to give up and become part of the soil it stood on. There was no electricity for the first month, no running water for the first 2. Margaret hauled water from a creek a mile away, carrying it in plastic buckets that cut into her palms, limping back and forth in the half-light of dawn because the heat of the day made her pelvis scream. She was not trying to build anything grand. She was trying to survive. She planted a garden because she had to eat. She kept chickens because she needed eggs. She woke up every morning and forced her damaged body to move, to dig, to carry, to persist, because the alternative was to lie down and wait for the end. And Margaret was not a woman who knew how to stop moving. Even broken, even beaten, even abandoned by everyone who had once claimed to love her, she rose before the sun and went to work. And then the trucks came. The first time it happened, Margaret was standing at her fence line, trying to repair a section that had fallen during the winter rains. She heard the engine before she saw it, the grinding of gears as the heavy truck navigated the rutted road that led to her property. She thought they were lost. She thought they would turn around. She even raised her hand to wave, to offer directions, because in her experience people were basically decent and mistakes happened. The truck did not stop to ask permission. It pulled up to the edge of her land, the exact spot where her property met the county road, and the bed tilted with a hydraulic groan that sounded like a dying animal. And then the bark scraps came pouring out, a waterfall of brown and tan and gold, the outer skins of trees that had been stripped away by the mill's machinery, mixed with sawdust and wood chips, and the occasional nail or bolt that the workers had been too careless to remove. It hit the ground with a sound like thunder, a sound that shook the earth and sent chickens scattering in panic. Margaret stood there with her mouth open. She walked toward the driver, who was already climbing back into his cab, dusting his hands with the satisfaction of a man who had done this 1,000 times before and would do it 1,000 times again. Margaret asked what was happening. The driver did not look at her. He said the mill had been dumping here for years. He said the previous owner had never complained. He said if Margaret had a problem, she could take it up with the mill's lawyers. And then he laughed, a short, harsh sound that held no humor, and drove away, leaving Margaret standing in a cloud of dust and the smell of fresh-cut wood. The pile was 20 feet wide and 10 feet high. Margaret did not call the lawyers. She could not afford a lawyer. She could not afford the phone call. She stood in front of that pile of bark and felt the old familiar feeling that had been her companion for most of her adult life. The feeling of being small in a world that was very large and very indifferent. The feeling of being told that she did not matter, that her property did not matter, that her life did not matter. She went back to her cabin and did not sleep that night. In the morning, the pile was still there. And in the morning, another truck came. Margaret watched from her window as the second load joined the first, expanding the mountain, burying the fence she had been repairing, spilling onto the road in a cascade of organic debris that the driver did not bother to clean up. She watched the truck leave. She watched the dust settle. She watched the pile grow. And then she did something that no one expected. She walked outside with a shovel. She did not attack the pile in anger. She did not set it on fire, though the thought crossed her mind. She did not stand in the road and block the next truck, though she imagined the confrontation 100 times. Instead, she dug into the oldest section, the part that had been dumped first, and she looked at what time had already begun to do. The bark was changing. Under the surface, where the sun could not reach and the rain had soaked in, the wood was breaking down. Fungus had colonized the scraps, white threads weaving through the brown like a spider's web. The material was damp, warm, alive with the activity of organisms too small to see, but too powerful to ignore. It smelled not of fresh wood, but of earth, of forest floors, of the deep places where life renews itself. Margaret had spent her life working with fabric, but she had grown up in the country, before the accident, before the city, before the life that had been taken from her. She knew what decay looked like. She knew that wood was not dead, not truly, not even after it was cut. It was simply waiting, storing energy, holding carbon, ready to become something else if given the right conditions. She knew that a pile of sawdust could heat a greenhouse. She knew that decomposing bark could feed soil. She knew these things because her father had been a carpenter, because she had played in his workshop as a child, because she understood wood in a way that the mill owners never would. They saw waste. Margaret saw possibility, but possibility was not enough. Not then. Not yet. She had a garden to tend, and a pelvis that would not stop hurting, and a well that ran brown, and a life that felt like it was shrinking every single day. She covered the pile with a tarp to keep the moisture in, and she went back to her struggling plants and her hungry chickens, and she tried to forget about the mountain that was growing at her gate. But the mill did not forget. The trucks came every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, rain or shine, summer or winter, holiday or workday. The trucks rolled down the dirt road at 6 in the morning and deposited their loads with the mechanical indifference of a system that had never been questioned. Margaret tried to talk to the drivers. Some ignored her. Some laughed at her. One told her that the mill produced 20 tons of bark scraps every week, and that if Margaret did not want them, The alternative was to pay for disposal, which the mill was not going to do, which meant Margaret could either accept the delivery or the mill would find somewhere else to dump, and the somewhere else would probably be the creek that ran through Margaret's property. And then how would she like that? Margaret did not want that. She stopped talking to the drivers. She stopped standing at the fence. She retreated into her cabin and her garden and her silence. And the mountain grew. By the end of the first year, it was 50 feet across and 20 feet high. It blocked the view from her porch. It attracted rats in the dry season and flies in the wet. The neighbors, the few who lived on the same road, began to complain. Not to the mill, of course. The mill was too powerful. They complained to Margaret, as if she had invited this, as if she were somehow responsible for the waste that had been forced upon her. They told her the pile was lowering their property values. They told her it was a fire hazard. They told her it was ugly, which it was, and that she should do something about it, which she could not. The second year, the county got involved. An inspector came in a white truck and took photographs and wrote notes on a clipboard. He told Margaret that the pile was in violation of at least 3 ordinances. He told Margaret that she would need to remove it or face fines. Margaret asked who would pay for the removal. The inspector looked at her as if she were stupid. Margaret explained that she had not created the pile. She explained that she had tried to stop the trucks. She explained that she was a poor woman with a shattered pelvis and 20 acres of clay and no money for lawyers or fines or removal. The inspector wrote more notes. The fines arrived in the mail. Margaret did not pay them. She could not. She let them stack on her kitchen table like another kind of debris, another mountain that was growing without her consent, another burden that the world had decided she should carry. The mill continued to dump. The county continued to threaten. The neighbors continued to blame. And Margaret continued to wake up every morning and dig into the pile with her shovel, turning the bark, moving the oldest material to the center, keeping the moisture balanced, watching the transformation that no one else could see. By the third year, she had stopped trying to fight the system. She had learned what the system was. It was not designed to help women like her. It was designed to protect men like the mill owner, who donated to the sheriff's re-election campaign and sat on the county planning board and had a lawyer on retainer who could bury a complaint in paperwork until the complainant gave up or died or moved away. Margaret was not going to win a legal battle. She was not going to win a political battle. She was not going to win a public relations battle. The only battle she could win was the one against the bark itself. She began to study it in earnest. She went to the library in town, a place she had not visited since she was a child, and she checked out books on composting and soil science and microbiology. She read about carbon-to-nitrogen ratios. She learned about thermophilic bacteria that could raise the temperature of a compost pile to 160 degrees. She discovered that the very material the mill considered garbage was, in the right conditions, one of the most valuable soil amendments on Earth, black gold. That was what the books called it. Compost so rich, so dark, so full of life that it could turn sand into soil and clay into loam and dead earth into a garden. Farmers paid hundreds of dollars a ton for material like this. Landscapers ordered it by the truckload. Gardeners called it the secret to everything. And the mill was giving it to Margaret for free. The realization did not come as a flash of lightning. It came slowly, over months of reading and digging and observing, over seasons of turning the pile and feeling the heat and watching the colors change from brown to black. It came as a whisper at first, then as a conversation, then as a conviction that settled into her bones with the weight of something true. She was not the victim of a dumping operation. She was the recipient of a gift that the giver did not understand. But understanding was not enough. The pile was still a problem. It was still too large, too wet, too raw, too full of uncomposted material that would take years to break down on its own. The rats still came. The flies still bred. The neighbors still complained. And Margaret's pelvis still hurt. Every day, every hour, every time she lifted the shovel that had become her most constant companion. She needed a system. She began to build one. She divided the mountain into sections. The fresh material went to the north side, where it could begin its decomposition without contaminating the older piles. The material that was 6 months old went to the middle, where she could turn it and monitor its progress. The material that was a year old or more went to the south side, where the composting was nearly complete and the black gold was beginning to emerge. She built channels for air. Using PVC pipe she scavenged from a construction site. She built a roof to control the rain. Using corrugated metal she found abandoned by the highway. She built a screen from chicken wire and wood scraps, the kind of screen that could separate the finished compost from the material that still needed time. She worked alone. Always alone. The neighbors watched her from their trucks, shaking their heads at the crazy woman who was organizing garbage instead of getting rid of it. The mill drivers watched her from their cabs, laughing at the old cripple who had given up fighting and was now playing in the trash like a child in a sandbox. The county inspector came back once, saw the organization, and was confused enough to leave without writing another fine. Margaret did not care what any of them thought. She had found her purpose by the 5th year. The first section of black gold was ready. It was not perfect. It still had pieces of bark that had not fully broken down. It still had the occasional nail that had slipped through the screen, but it was dark, rich, alive with the smell of earth and forest and possibility. Margaret carried it to her garden in a wheelbarrow that squeaked with every revolution, and she spread it over the clay that had defeated her for so long. The change was not immediate. Nothing in nature is immediate. The soil did not turn to chocolate cake overnight. The plants did not double in size. But something happened. The water stayed longer. The clay loosened. The worms appeared, dozens of them, then hundreds, then thousands. Creatures that had not been seen on this property in decades because the soil had been too dead to support them. Margaret planted tomatoes. She had planted tomatoes every year since she arrived, and every year they had struggled. The clay had strangled their roots. The iron in the water had burned their leaves. But this year, with the black gold mixed into the earth, the tomatoes grew. They grew tall and strong and heavy with fruit that was red and sweet and better than anything Margaret had ever tasted. She ate them standing in her garden, juice running down her chin, tears running down her face. She was not a woman who cried easily. She had not cried when her husband left. She had not cried when the doctors told her her pelvis would never heal. She had not cried when the fines arrived, or the neighbors yelled, or the mill drivers laughed. But she cried in her garden that summer, surrounded by plants that were thriving because of something she had built with her own 2 hands, something that the world had given her as garbage, and she had transformed into life. She began to expand. She could not stop. The trucks kept coming 3 times a week, every month, every year. The pile kept growing, and Margaret kept turning it, sifting it, building it, learning from it. She built more screens. She built more channels. She built a shed to store the finished compost, a shed made from pallets and scrap metal, and the sheer determination of a woman who had learned that waste was only a word for something whose purpose had not yet been discovered. By the 7th year, she had more compost than she could use. Her garden was overflowing. Her chickens were healthy. Her well, miraculously, was running clearer. as if the improved soil on the surface was somehow filtering the water below. But she had piles of black gold that she did not know what to do with, piles that were taking up space and demanding attention and waiting for a purpose that Margaret had not yet imagined. She started giving it away at first to the neighbors who had complained. She knocked on their doors with bags of compost, awkward and silent, not knowing how to explain what she was offering. Some refused. Some took the bags and threw them away out of spite. But a few took them to their gardens, and a few of those gardens began to thrive. And those few neighbors stopped complaining and started asking questions. Then she gave it to the community garden in town, a patch of land behind the church that had been struggling for years. The organizers were skeptical. They had heard about Margaret's pile. They had smelled it on hot days, but they were desperate, and the compost was free, and they had nothing to lose. The community garden exploded. Vegetables grew in abundance. Flowers bloomed in colors that had not been seen in that soil for a generation. The church started a food pantry with the excess. The local newspaper wrote a small article, the first time Margaret's name had appeared in print since her accident, and the article was not about a broken seamstress or a failing farmer, but about a woman who had found a way to turn waste into wealth. The mill owner read the article. He did not understand it. He had built his fortune on the assumption that bark scraps were worthless, that they were a cost to be minimized, a problem to be dumped. The idea that someone was making something valuable from his garbage confused him. It angered him, though he could not say why. He called his lawyer and asked if Margaret was somehow stealing from him. The lawyer explained that garbage once dumped belonged to the person on whose property it lay. The mill owner hung up the phone and stared at the article and felt a strange, uncomfortable feeling that he did not recognize as the first stirring of respect. By the 10th year, Margaret had a business. She did not mean to build one. It simply happened. The neighbors who had accepted her compost told their friends. The community garden told other churches. The newspaper article was shared online, and people from the next county started driving down the dirt road to Margaret's gate, where the mountain had once been a symbol of defeat and was now a landmark of curiosity. They came with trucks and trailers and empty buckets. They came with questions and cameras and notebooks. They came to buy the black gold that Margaret had been giving away, and when she told them there was no price because she had never thought to charge, they insisted on paying her anyway. She set a price. It was lower than the garden centers, lower than the landscaping suppliers, lower than anyone else who sold compost of comparable quality, because Margaret did not think of herself as a businesswoman, and she did not know how to value something that had cost her nothing but time and pain, and the stubborn refusal to give up. The business grew, not because Margaret advertised. She did not own a computer. She did not have a website. She did not understand social media or marketing or search engine optimization. The business grew because the product was extraordinary, because the people who used it came back for more, because the tomatoes and the roses and the lawns that were fed by Margaret's black gold were so obviously superior that word spread without any help from her. By the 12th year, she had hired her first employee, a young woman from town who had been in trouble with the law, who had no references and no prospects and no one willing to give her a chance. Margaret did not ask about her past. She asked only if the young woman could lift a shovel and if she was willing to learn. The young woman could, and she was. And she stayed for 3 years, longer than anyone expected, because Margaret treated her with a dignity that no one else had ever offered. Then came a second employee, a single father who needed flexible hours. Then a third, a retired teacher who wanted to work outdoors. Margaret built a small office from more pallets and scrap metal. She bought a used truck with the profits from her first year of real sales. She built a loading dock and a parking area and a sign that read Black Gold Compost, hand-painted in letters that were crooked but sincere. The mill still dumped. The trucks still came 3 times a week, but now Margaret welcomed them. She stood at her gate, no longer angry, no longer defeated, and watched the fresh material arrive with the satisfaction of a woman who understood that her supply chain was infinite and free. The drivers, over the years, had stopped laughing. They had watched the transformation from their cabs. They had seen the mountain shrink and the operation grow. Some of them started bringing Margaret coffee in the mornings. Some started asking her advice about their own gardens. The 14th year brought the drought. It was the worst drought in the region's recorded history. The reservoirs emptied. The wells failed. The industrial farms that had covered the valley in monoculture turned brown and died. The farmers who had relied on irrigation and chemical fertilizers watched their crops wither and their loans default and their futures disappear. But Margaret's land was green, not because she had water that others did not, because her soil was different. The black gold that she had spent 14 years building held moisture like a sponge. The organic matter that the compost had added to her clay soil created a structure that water could penetrate and remain. The plants that grew in her garden did not need daily irrigation. They needed only the rain that fell. And when the rain stopped falling, they survived because the soil held reserves that conventional agriculture had never learned to build. Farmers came to see her. At first, they came out of desperation. They had heard about the crazy woman with the compost pile, and they were willing to try anything to save their land. Margaret gave them compost. She gave them advice. She walked them through her operation and showed them how the bark scraps became black gold, how the carbon and the nitrogen balanced, how the heat and the moisture and the time worked together to create something that no factory could manufacture. Some listened, most did not. They wanted a product they could buy and apply and see results in a week. They did not want to hear about patience. They did not want to hear about building soil over years. They wanted a miracle. And when Margaret told them that the miracle was simply time and attention and the willingness to work with nature instead of against it, they went back to their dying farms and blamed the drought for their failures. But a few listened. A young man who had inherited his grandfather's orchard and was watching it die came to Margaret and stayed for a month. He learned her system. He went home and stopped tilling, started mulching, began building compost from the waste his own farm produced. His orchard survived the drought. His peaches were the sweetest in the county that year. He came back every season to learn more, and eventually he became Margaret's partner, not in business but in mission, spreading the knowledge that soil was not a medium for chemicals, but a living system that needed to be fed. By the 17th year, Margaret had an empire, not an empire of steel and glass and stock options, an empire of soil. She sold compost to 27 counties. She consulted with organic farms across 3 states. She hosted students from agricultural universities who came to study her methods and left with a different understanding of what farming could be. She built a proper barn to replace the scrap metal shed. She built a house with a straight roof and windows that did not leak. She built a life that no longer felt like survival but like thriving. And still the trucks came. The mountain was different now. It was organized. It was managed. It was a production facility rather than a dump site, with sections and schedules and a workforce that knew exactly how to turn fresh bark into finished compost in 18 months. But the material was the same. The trucks were the same. The mill that had once been her tormentor was now her most reliable supplier. delivering the raw material for her empire 3 times a week with the regularity of a heartbeat. The mill owner came to visit. He was old now, older than Margaret, and the empire he had built on lumber and plywood was struggling. The market had changed. The regulations had tightened. The cheap disposal that had once been his competitive advantage was now a liability, as environmental laws caught up with practices that had been grandfathered in for decades. He stood at Margaret's gate and looked at the operation that had grown from his garbage, and he did not know what to say. Margaret invited him in. She showed him the piles. She showed him the thermometers that tracked the internal heat. She showed him the screens, the sheds, the trucks, the customers. She showed him the garden where the tomatoes still grew, where it had all started, where a broken woman had stood crying in the sun because life had returned to soil that everyone had given up on. The mill owner asked how she had done it. Margaret thought for a long time. She was not a woman of many words, and the words she needed now were not in her usual vocabulary. Finally, she said that she had not done anything special. She had simply stopped fighting the bark and started listening to it. She had learned that the mill's waste was not waste at all. It was wood, and wood came from trees, and trees came from soil, and soil was just wood and leaves and time and patience, returning to where they had come from. The mill owner left with a truckload of compost for his own garden. He paid full price. By the 20th year, Margaret was 62. Her pelvis was worse. Her limp was more pronounced. She could no longer lift a shovel, though she still tried, every morning, until her employees gently took the tool from her hands and reminded her that she had built something bigger than herself, and that it was time to let others carry the weight. She spent her days walking the property, touching the piles, smelling the earth, watching the transformation that had become her life's work and would continue long after she was gone. The county named the dirt road after her, Margaret Road, a road that had once been the address of a failure, a dumping ground, a place where no one wanted to live. Now it was the address of the most respected soil operation in the region. The neighbors who had complained for years now bragged about their proximity. The real estate values had tripled. The community garden had expanded into a network of gardens across the county, all fed by Margaret's compost, all teaching the same lesson that she had learned in her darkest hours. Waste is not real. It is only a word for something whose purpose has not yet been found. The 25th year arrived quietly. Margaret woke up on the anniversary of the first dump truck and walked to her gate, as she did every morning, and watched the sun rise over the piles that had once been a mountain of failure and were now a landscape of abundance. The trucks still came. They would always come, as long as the mill operated, as long as trees were cut and bark was stripped, and industry produced the byproducts that most people called garbage. But Margaret no longer saw garbage. She saw soil. She saw life. She saw the future. She had started with nothing, less than nothing. She had started with a shattered pelvis and a broken marriage and a broken bank account and a piece of land that no one wanted. She had started with a mountain dumped at her gate by a system that considered her disposable. She had started with fines and complaints and laughter and loneliness. And she had built an empire, not an empire of conquest, an empire of transformation, an empire that proved every single day that the most valuable things in the world are often the things we throw away. That the poorest woman can become the richest if she learns to see what others cannot. That the longest suffering can lead to the greatest reward if you refuse to let the world define what is possible. Margaret stood at her gate as the morning truck rumbled down the road. The driver waved, Margaret waved back. And as the bark scraps poured onto the receiving pile, beginning their journey from waste to black gold, Margaret smiled. because she knew, with a certainty that had been earned through 25 years of hard labor and harder faith, that the mountain would never stop growing, and neither would she. The young woman who had been her first employee stayed longer than anyone expected. Her name was Elena, and she had come to Margaret with a probation officer's note and a face that held no hope. She had been arrested twice for theft, once for fighting, and her mother had told her that if she did not find a job within 30 days, she would have to leave the house. Margaret did not ask about the arrests. She handed Elena a shovel and showed her how to turn a pile, how to feel the heat with the back of her hand, how to smell the difference between raw bark and finished compost. She showed her that the work was not about moving dirt. It was about understanding transformation. Elena learned slowly at first. She was angry, and anger makes a poor student. She resented the early mornings and the physical labor, and the silence that Margaret preferred over conversation. But something changed in her third month, on a morning when the fog had settled low over the piles, and the steam was rising from the center of the oldest section like breath from a sleeping giant. Elena had stuck her hands into the hot core and pulled them back in surprise, and Margaret had smiled for the first time in Elena's presence, a small, quiet smile that said, "I remember when I felt that same wonder." Elena stayed for 6 years. She became the foreman. She learned to drive the delivery truck and manage the accounts and talk to customers who wanted to know the science behind the magic. She got married in the garden where Margaret had first cried over her tomatoes, and Margaret stood beside her as a witness, wearing a dress that had been borrowed from the church's donation closet. When Elena's first child was born, she named her Grace, and she brought her to the compost piles before she could walk, holding her close so she could feel the warmth of the earth that was changing, always changing from death into life. Margaret never had another child. Her husband had taken their daughter when he left, a girl of 7 who had grown into a woman Margaret did not know. She had sent letters that were never answered. She had made phone calls that went to disconnected numbers. She had stood in the driveway of her old house one Christmas Eve, holding a gift she could not afford, watching the lights through the window, turning away before anyone saw her. She had carried that absence like a second shattered pelvis, a pain that never healed because it was never given the chance. But in her 23rd year, a letter arrived. It was not from her daughter. It was from her grandson, a boy of 19 who had found Margaret's name in an old box of papers his mother had kept without ever mentioning. The boy wrote that he was studying environmental science at a university 3 states away. He wrote that he had read about Margaret in a textbook, a case study in regenerative waste management, and had not realized until he saw the photograph that the woman in the book was the grandmother he had never met. He wrote that he wanted to visit. He wrote that he wanted to learn. He wrote that his mother had never stopped talking about Margaret, not in anger, but in a sadness that the boy had never understood until now. Margaret read the letter 12 times. She read it in the morning, sitting on her porch with coffee that had gone cold. She read it at noon, standing in the middle of her operation, while trucks loaded and employees worked, and the world continued its business around her. She read it at night, by the light of a lamp that flickered because the wiring was still old, because some things had changed and some things had not. The boy came on a Saturday in spring. Margaret watched him from the window of her office, a young man with her daughter's eyes and her own stubborn jaw, carrying a backpack and wearing boots that were too clean for real work. Margaret did not rush out to greet him. She let the boy stand at the gate for a moment, looking at the piles that stretched into the distance, the steam rising, the trucks moving, the empire that had grown from a mountain of waste. Then Margaret walked out and extended her hand. The boy did not shake it. He hugged her. They walked the property together, grandmother and grandson, the old woman limping and the young man slowing his pace to match. Margaret showed him the fresh piles, the active piles, the finished piles. She explained the carbon cycle and the nitrogen balance and the thermophilic bacteria that did the real work. She explained that composting was not a human invention. It was a human observation. The forest had been doing this for millions of years, turning fallen trees into soil, building the earth inch by inch, century by century. With no help from anyone, the boy stayed for the summer. He worked alongside Elena and the others, learning to turn a pile with a shovel, to read the temperature, to recognize the sweet smell of finished compost and the sour smell of a pile that had gone anaerobic and needed air. He learned that the work was not glamorous. It was hot and dirty and smelled of decay. But it was honest. It was necessary. It was the foundation of everything that grew. On his last day, the boy asked Margaret why she had never given up. Margaret was standing at the gate, watching the afternoon truck make its delivery, the bark scraps tumbling down in a cascade of brown and gold. She thought about the question for a long time, longer than she had thought about anything in years. Finally, she said that giving up had never been an option because the trucks had never stopped coming. The world had kept dumping its problems at her gate, day after day, year after year, and the only choice she had ever had was to let the pile bury her or to learn to climb it. She had climbed it, and from the top, she had seen something that no one else could see. She had seen that the waste was not the enemy. The waste was the invitation. The universe had been asking her, every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for 25 years, the same question: what are you going to do with this? And every time she had answered with her back and her hands and her stubborn, unshakable faith that nothing was ever truly lost. The boy left with a truckload of compost for his university's experimental farm. He left with a photograph of himself and Margaret standing in front of the oldest pile, the one that had been there from the beginning, the one that had started everything. He left with a promise to return, and a new understanding of his mother, and a grandmother he would never again have to wonder about. Margaret watched him drive away. She did not cry. She had used up her tears long ago, in the garden, over the tomatoes. But she felt something in her chest that was lighter than it had been in decades. A loosening, a peace. The sense that a circle she had not known was broken was now finally complete. She turned and walked back to her piles. The trucks would come tomorrow, and she would be ready.